I can hear you fine, Charlie. Thank you very much. It's amazing the way you're doing this. It's so exciting. It's so much more open than anything before. It's a brilliant thing you're doing. And listen, thank you so much. It's great to be on this because it feels like this is the subject. The subject of resilience is something that is so on our mind. So I'm delighted to have the chance, frankly, to listen to Divya Chander. When you read her CV, you sort of stopped in your tracks, physician, neuroscientist, Harvard, Stanford, the works. I've had a sneak preview of the slide she's going to talk us through, and Lila Tretikov, who's the Deputy Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft, no less, is also going to try and talk us through, help us think through what resilience means. And then we're going to have a conversation, but as Charlie said, please, weigh in early. I'm going to try and make sure that as many comments and questions get put to Divya and Lila as possible. But Divya, please join us and talk us through the presentation on a more resilient world. Oh, well, there's Lila and there's Divya. Hello all. Divya, do you want...
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And it's really a pleasure to be with you. I think myself and Lila are going to do sort of a brief introduction to this topic so that you guys can ask questions and converse with us a bit more. But as Charlie said in his introduction, we're at this point where the globe has experienced basically a pandemic since 2020. And the thing I want to emphasize is that the burden of disease and the death toll itself has disproportionately fallen to the most vulnerable people all over the world. These are people who are both medically vulnerable and even socioeconomically vulnerable. And unfortunately, many of the international bodies, for instance, like the WHO, that have been tasked to deal with this kind of thing, to deal with basically providing the planet with a way to surveil, answer, and take care of global health, which you see in their mission statement. They haven't been able to do so. And it's for many reasons. One of the many is that they have been underfunded and understaffed, so essentially under-resourced. So what do we need as a global population in order to develop pandemic resilience? Well, I'd argue that it is twofold. The first thing is we need an early warning system, much as we track threats like hurricanes and tornadoes and tsunamis and things of that nature. We need a mechanism as a planet whereby we can actually track novel pathogens or pathogens that we already know about that are cropping up again in hotspots around the world. So we need this detection system, threat alert. And the second thing is we need to build an agile, responsive global immune system. Now, this means many, many things. In order to develop this kind of global immune system, as many of you know, we need to develop healthcare capacity. And healthcare capacity means multiple things. One, it means something similar or akin to having universal healthcare from cradle to grave in most parts of the world. And as many of you know, we don't even have that in the United States. But it also means building in different kinds of capacities so that if we do identify a pathogen, we know how to act. One way to do that would be to do things like stockpile vaccines, or even in this case, search for a universal flu vaccine. Basically, this is an approach where we look for parts of viruses that don't mutate every season or in cycles so that we can essentially vaccinate or inoculate people once. Another thing that we need to increase our capacity to respond is to create a world in which vaccines are not just sort of held onto or hoarded by either pharma companies or by governments in the locations in which these vaccines were developed. We need a mechanism whereby vaccines can be democratized and equitably distributed throughout the world. And to do this, we'll actually need funds that support this kind of effort. CEPI is one of these global public-private partnerships that is engaged in this. But the more interesting thing that I want to talk to you about is this idea of global surveillance, the thing that the WHO just couldn't do on its own. And global surveillance, I believe, needs to be crowdsourced at this point. It's not something that any one body can do. It's not something that any one government can do. For example, this is something from nextstrain.org. how might we actually track novel pathogens or pathogens that are mutating? Well, we can follow viral genomes across the planet, and we can use artificial intelligence to actually help us with this. We can use novel technologies for sensing. So far, everybody has understood that we needed more and more and more testing. What if testing weren't just PCR based? What if we could use technologies like CRISPR, which we use to read and write genomes in order to detect viruses as they crop up? In fact, if you can identify the sequence of the genome that we need to detect, you could build a plug and play cartridge system. And when you discover a novel pathogen, just take the new guide mRNA that matches the viral sequence you're looking for, and you've developed a new test. So these are different mechanisms by which we might be able to be prepared as part of our immune system. Another thing we're going to have to do is active telemonitoring and sensing. And that is not just through systems like telehealth systems, but it's through instrumenting ourselves through things like wearables and Fitbits. It's by using interconnected devices in an IoT manner and machine-based vision, so we can do some of this kind of monitoring. And this is one of many companies out there that it's actually developing sensors that might be able to be deployed to entire populations. Passive monitoring is the other thing I wanted to make sure everyone knew about. There are biosensors that have now been developed that can monitor things like the air. This company, BioBot, is actually assaying sewage and wastewater in order to actually detect viral RNA. And what's really interesting is in a hotspot outside of Boston, they discovered that the viral burden coming through wastewater that was flushed down people's toilets was something on the order of 3 orders of magnitude higher than what was actually detected by active testing protocols. Another thing that might help us is to do things like using smart toilets, so we can actually analyze the information we flush down. And this would be especially useful for capturing things like asymptomatic carriers. This was just reported in the New York Times yesterday. We can use satellites to help us. Through satellite imaging, they're trying to now create an internet of animals to help us with things like animal migration and climate change. But you can actually look at temperature changes and things like migrating ducks. And avian flu is a huge source of a very, very deadly kind of flu. So this is another mechanism by which we can do this. Finally, things like contact tracing. So several companies have tried to do contact tracing through things that are like apps. But what we're missing in the global immune system is a mechanism for integration. And I would argue that distributed networks that are encrypted, in which data is properly labeled, made interoperable and actionable is the way to go. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a system in which we're surveilled and we give up our civil liberties. Finally, I wanted to end by saying that global health and pandemic resilience will not happen in a vacuum. For one, we actually need good sanitation. This is Jack Sim's organization, the World Toilet Organization, and their goal is to make sure there's adequate sanitation in most parts of the world. We have to deal with vulnerable populations that have been overcrowded, migrants. I mean, take a look at our own US-Mexican border. This is a breeding ground for future pandemics. We need to deal with things like water security. If you can't even wash your hands, if there isn't enough soap to go around, it's very easy to transmit disease. Food security will be another one of these such issues. And finally, I cannot overstate the impact of climate change and giving rise to zoonotic illnesses. This is something that we are going to have to attack head on. And also our meat production, factory farming, as well as wet markets, have led to humans and animals encroaching upon one another's space. And that might mean doing things like cellular-based meat or moving to more plant-based diets. So with that, I'm going to end, and I'm going to pass the baton to Lila to talk to you about some more specific examples.
The most important thing that we need to understand in terms of being able to react, we need to be able to get access to information and data, which is something that we did not have here. And once we have it, we can do incredible things and really, really rapidly to address this. From medical point of view, innovation is absolutely astounding. throughout this crisis.
Well, so I think it's so interesting, and it'd be great to bring Divya back too, because it feels to me as though, and I think I traced most of it. The audio was a little in and out, and apologies to people who are listening who struggled a little as I did. But actually, if you put together what Divya Chander, Dr. Chander was saying, and what you're saying, you are talking about two sets of very fundamental changes. One is about capacity, and the other is about data. And Divya, if I can actually come to you first on this point about capacity, I wrote down some of the things that you were saying. We need to have, global capacity in healthcare like the WHO. We need to think about universal healthcare. We need to think about IoT and future sensors. All of these things require individuals, in the way in which Lila was talking about, to surrender a certain amount of data and expense for the public good. And so how do you translate the idea into reality? Because you've got to deal with the politics of it. And I wonder whether we could bring Divya back to sort of to see how that could happen.
Hi there. So I did hear your question. Thanks for the question. It's a great question. I think that if you actually look at the global economic cost of this particular virus, and let's take out the lives. I'm a doctor, I care about the lives, but for those who might be having to provide some of the paychecks to support and fund these initiatives, if you look at the total economic collapse that occurred, wouldn't it be far better if we could convince them to invest a certain percentage of GDP towards developing things like global vaccine funds, to develop capabilities for collecting and integrating data. In fact, I'm 100% aligned with Lila on this because, in fact, we're building, my company Plexus, we're building actually a data integration network so that we can bring in multiple streams coming from lots of nodes. And I think that, I'm even seeing people saying that, well, what do you do to deal with encouraging people to do this or to get vaccinated, etc. I think it's going to take a lot of on-the-ground trust. I think it's going to take a lot of narrative, but we need to share in this new global narrative.
I suppose my question is really around a fundamental change in the relationship between people and technology. In that, if you think about it, in our lifetimes, technology has had wonderful individual benefits, but quite profound and difficult social costs, right? Yeah. In this instance, what you're saying is, no, the individual may not enormously benefit, and Lila's point is the same in the handover of data, but the social benefits will be huge. And presumably it's going to be governments then that are going to have to pay for these new technologies, for these new capacities.
I'm not 100% sure it's just governments. I do think that governments should be contributing. You'll find private funds that are contributing. You'll find philanthropists, that you'll even find startups and companies that are contributing towards this. I don't think it will be entirely put on the shoulders of governments, but clearly in terms of access to funds and funding things that don't have immediate return on investment, it's easier to convince them to contribute.
Right. How do you make sure that the most vulnerable are enabled by the usage of data and a more resilient technology that comes from it?
Yeah, so my personal passion is all about bringing the technology to the people who traditionally have been underserved. So, for the last couple of years, I've been working on specifically tools, digital tools that are designed for what we call frontline workers. So these are people who are in the medical profession, who are out there directly interfacing with patients, for example. So I work on a device called HoloLens, which is a computer that's on your face, and that is the computer that doctors right now are using directly at Imperial College in London, for example. And instead of having 20 doctors exposed to a patient, for example, 20 nurses, only one. Right, so that increases dramatically exposure and safety, and increases safety of a frontline worker like that. So technology like that, we need to have more of them, and we need to focus on bringing them to everybody who's working out there and protecting everyone of us.
Well, listen. absurdly, we've opened possibly the most important conversation of the 2020s, and I have the ridiculous job of then closing it down because, you know, we're on a tight timetable and we must finish promptly at the half hour. But I hope that people have been prompted to your work, Dr. Chander, and to look into it, and to your work, Lila Tretikov, and to make sure that we look into it, exactly what you're talking about, and we will follow it very, very closely. Thank you for the chance for all of us to hear your ideas. Mind expanding. Charlie, back to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Lila. Thank you, Divya. That was an amazing session to end CogX's leadership stage on for 2020. I really appreciate you making the time to share that conversation with us. And thank you, the audience, as well. That's the last content session we have, and we've now got one more session we're going to jump to in just a minute, so don't go anywhere.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.